We now turn to looking at more of Thomas Hobbes from Leviathan, and then we'll finish up looking at some problems for ethical egoism. So, how does Hobbes get us out of the state of nature and into a system of moral philosophy as he sees it? Now, as we saw last time, he's talking about the laws of nature, and he takes the view that the science of these laws that he was discussing is the true moral philosophy, and that the science of them is the true and only moral philosophy. So essentially he's saying his theory is the correct one. So what is moral philosophy on his view? Well, again, his sort of objective is to apply a scientific approach to politics and morality, and his view is that moral philosophy is a science, but it's a science of what is good and evil, which is, of course, not surprising because morality is about good and evil and all that stuff. But he sees it as a science about what is good and evil in essentially preserving humanity in the conversation and society of mankind. So, as we noted before in the introduction, he takes good and evil to be essentially subjective. Good and evil, as he sees it, are merely names that signify, that note our desires and aversions. And of course, people differ quite a bit in terms of their what they like and dislike, in terms of their tempers, customs, and doctrines, and these are all different. Now, people also, of course, differ in part because of their senses in terms of what is pleasant or unpleasant, which seems to be, in a way, obviously true, because when we think of things like people, to give the example of taste, in terms of foods people like and dislike, people vary quite a bit. Not everyone likes all foods, clearly, and some people, dislike foods other people love, and vice versa. Similarly for smell, there are smells that some people find pleasant that other people find, awful. Similarly with hearing, good example would be things like music. People, many people like the music of Taylor Swift, to use, the current superstar. Other people are indifferent or actually dislike that music. Touch, some people enjoy the touch of certain, say, fabrics, for example, or certain things. Other people find certain touches to be, really unpleasant. And there are some that seem to be fairly consistent. For example, really gross, smushy, muddy stuff people tend to not like, except, of course, those people who do. And sight, of course, what people regard as beautiful or ugly. And we can include here, today, movies would be a good example, which people like and dislike. And so people clearly disagree and differ in terms of what they find to be pleasant and unpleasant. And this is all, subjective, and this all seems quite reasonable, that we regard the pleasant and unpleasant as quite different. We also disagree beyond just our experiences of the senses, what we find to be pleasant or unpleasant. So, for example, if someone says they really like plantains and someone else says, they're yucky, no one's right and no one's wrong, simply because people like what they like and dislike what they dislike. So that seems reasonable. He also notes that people differ in terms of not just their senses and experiences in that regard, but what they think of as, conformable or disagreeable to reason in the actions of common life, which is his way of putting people disagree about what they think is reasonable in terms of, what people do in life. So these would be things beyond just taste, tasting food, smelling, etc. But things like this would be opinions about, say, laws and policies and diet and so forth. Not whether things taste good or bad, but whether something's good or bad for you. So quite a bit of disagreement. He also pushes this even further or farther by saying that that people, in their own case, at different times, differ from themselves, which, so one time they will praise and call good, one other time they, condemn and call, bad. And this can, of course, occur, over time. People, do change their minds about music or their values. We could have a case where someone, for example, is like a racist and belongs to a racist group, but then change their mind and they see racism as bad, or perhaps vice versa. Someone's not racist and they become racist and see it as good. And similarly for political values, etc. And so that does seem true. People do change their views. And this, on the face of it, you think, well, okay, people have different judgments about their senses. They have different views about things. People differ in their own views across time. But he thinks this leads to disputes, controversies, and war. In the case of things like taste of food, probably disputes will tend to be fairly minor for the most part. But in terms of things that are significant, like policies and laws and religion and so forth, then of course that can lead to disputes, controversies, and of course even war. Now Hobbes notes that in the state of nature, where there is no government, no human-made laws, he sees this as a state of war. And in that state, the only measure of good and evil is simply what you like or dislike, what you find desirable, what you find undesirable. Because he thinks there's nothing beyond that than what people essentially find pleasing and displeasing. Now, because of that, he thinks that people see this as, a bad thing, disputes, controversy, and war. And so he thinks people believe that peace is good and also the means to this peace. Now, of course, people don't, obviously we don't uniformly accept that peace is good, because if we did, we wouldn't have war, and we've always got wars going. But in general, if you were to ask people, hey, is peace, generally preferable to war? People would not surprisingly say yes. Generally, peace is better than war, even if they're involved in a war now, because people generally want to get back to peace so they can in many cases, get another war going. So what about virtues and vices, etc.? Hobbes, says that justice, gratitude, modesty, equity, mercy, and the rest of the laws of nature are good. Moral virtues and their contrary vices, these are virtues. And contrary vices, injustice, ingratitude, immodesty, lack of mercy would be evil, or so people claim. So he thinks that the science of this virtue and vice is moral philosophy. So you may say, hey, why isn't he considered a virtue theorist? Why is he being covered under ethical egoism? Well, here is why for Hobbes. So he thinks, again, the true doctrine of the laws of nature is the true moral philosophy, basically his view. And he thinks that previous writers, and he's probably thinking about people like Aristotle, that these writers of moral philosophy acknowledge the same virtues and vices that he does. So if you had, Hobbes and Aristotle alive and other moral philosophers and say, hey, what are the virtues and vices? And you give us a list, they'd probably agree. Now, where they disagree, and of course Hobbes thinks he's right, is that what makes these good. So these are praised as a means of peaceable, sociable, and comfortable living. And Hobbes thinks that these writers, probably referring to Aristotle, place in them a mediocrity of passions. Basically, he's referencing the mean between Aristotle's and other virtue theorists' mean, between two extremes, too much is bad, too little bad, just right, good. But he thinks they're mistaken. They are speaking as if not the cause, but the degree of daring made the fortitude, or the quantity of a gift made liberality. And he thinks that these dictates of reason, which people improperly call laws, are only conclusions about what is conducive to the conservation and defense of humanity. So Hobbes' view essentially is these virtues are not inherently, intrinsically valuable, as like Aristotle and others would tend to see these as as good things. And of course, the motivation to be good is for happiness. But Hobbes sees them as essentially means of preservation. So it's not that the virtues themselves are good, or that they have any value outside of this function. So Hobbes thinks essentially we create a form of ethics out of pure self-interest. And so that's the end of Thomas Hobbes. So what are some problems with ethical egoism? Some of the apparent defects. So here's a couple of problems. The first one that's often presented is inconsistency. The idea is this. So universal ethical egoism, as a moral theory, tells each of us that we should act to maximize the satisfaction of our own self-interest. And of course, there are different versions of ethical egoism in terms of what you're supposed to maximize, but the essential idea is that what is a value, I'm supposed to maximize it for me. So if I'm an ethical egoist, I would seem to have to also accept, given the theory, that other people should do this too. They should act to maximize their own self-interest or to maximize what is the value for them. And as Hobbes himself noted, the activities of other people will tend to conflict with my maximizing, satisfying my self-interest, or getting what is of value. So in general, the things that people would typically tend to value, power, fame, wealth, etc. Other people, control of land. Other people will be in conflict with me because I'll want, like that money, someone else will want it. So I, of course, as an ethical egoist, would think that, hey, they shouldn't do that. As a person, I wouldn't want them to do that because I want to give it as a value. So, for example, if I'm competing for a job and I'm an ethical egoist, I, of course, would want to get the job myself. And I wouldn't want them to get the job, anyone else to get the job, because, well, it's maximize my own self-interest. But of course, what I have to accept if I'm an ethical egoist, given the theory, is that they should do so, that they should try to get the job as well. And so it would seem that I would be inconsistent, because I would have to want, on the one hand, taking the example of the job, that only I should get the job. But I also have to accept that other people, out of self-interest, they should try just as hard to get the job as well, and it would be just as right for them to get it from their standpoint. So I can't be consistent, or so is the claim. Now, kind of the standard reply to this is that a person can distinguish between their philosophical view, what is the correct moral theory, and what they themselves want. So in the case of the job, if I was an ethical egoist, I would want to get the job for me. I wouldn't want anyone else to try to get it. I want everyone else to not be ethical egoists. But of course, if I'm an ethical egoist in my moral theory, I would have to, say rationally that, from the standpoint of the moral theory, I should try to get the job, but of course they should try to too. And we're both acting morally correctly, but of course I don't want them to get the job. Some draw an analogy to sports that, for example, if I go to run a 5K, I of course want to win and compete to win, but I recognize that other people, should also compete. So while I want to win, I don't want other people to lose. In that case, I accept that people should compete to win. Now, of course, a reply to this reply would be, well, that seems to not be really ethical egoism, because if you take the view that people should compete and the person who's best should win, that seems to be a different kind of moral view. So the inconsistency argument does seem to still have some bite. A second argument is the ironic argument. Not a super powerful one, but it's kind of a, that makes me think type of argument, which goes like this. So ethical egoists publish works that advocate and defend egoism, most famously Ayn Rand. Back when she was alive, she put out a book called The Virtue of Selfishness and was encouraging people to be selfish, right on the book title, and created like institutes, etc., that advocated a particular view. And there are people, as I mentioned, we talked about ethical egoism in the intro. There were people, as part of the Tea Party back, not so long ago, who explicitly, endorsed Ayn Rand, the idea that people should act out of the self-interest. So, but here is the irony. If I'm an ethical egoist, I'm better off if no one else is in on the ethical egoist game. I'm better served if there are as many altruists as possible, because other ethical egoists would be competing with me, because they would know that, or they would believe that they should be acting to maximize their own self-interest, and they wouldn't be helping me. They wouldn't be helping anybody. Now, altruists, of course, holding to the wrong moral theory, they'd be easy to exploit, because I would be looking to maximize my self-interest, get what is value for me. These foolish altruists would be helping me and not competing against me. And so what I would want would be to be the only ethical egoist in a world of altruists, to be the only, wolf in sheep's clothing in a world full of sheep. So informing other people of my view, if I was an ethical egoist, would seem to be ironically against my best interest, because I would be exposing myself like, hey, I'm an egoist, I'm selfish. I'd also be creating competition. I'd be creating people who would be competing against me. So if I was a smart ethical egoist, I would never argue for ethical egoism. And I would never obviously reveal my view, because if I told people, hey, I'm selfish, I'm only interested in myself and my own self-interest, that would hardly be appealing to most people. So a true ethical egoist would argue for non-ethical egoistic ethics and present the illusion that they accepted such a view. Going back to the ring, when you talk about the ring of Gyges, we'll see how this could play out. So this, of course, when we talked about moral theories back at the beginning, I mentioned the idea that moral theories have to be public. And of course, ideally, the ethical egoist would want to have a secret morality, but that violates the publicity thing, the public thing. But of course, if you're a clever ethical egoist, you would of course say moral theories have to be public, and you would argue for that. Now, getting back to the ironic part, so going with thinkers like Ayn Rand, for example, who publish books openly on ethical egoism, why would they do that? They're creating competition. So, couple replies. One, of course, although this would make you raise the question, why would someone who would benefit from being the only ethical egoist tell people to be ethical egoists? Why would they do that? It doesn't prove the theory is false. It doesn't show it's mistaken. There's also kind of an interesting reply where an ethical egoist, if they believe that they could benefit the most from selling, their philosophy, then that would make sense. That if they could, in a sense, profit and gain an advantage from it, presenting their perhaps their true view, then that would be reasonable. So, for example, Ayn Rand was quite successful. Created these institutes. She created like a kind of a movement and had books and movies, etc. And she made bank on her view. So in her case, it made sense. To use an analogy, it's kind of like those people who have guides to like becoming incredibly wealthy. They have the secrets of wealth success. And a good question would be is, well, if I have this incredible secret for becoming wealthy, why would I, unless I was a good, just a good, generous person, why would I go around telling people my secret? And a better question would be is, why would I have to charge people? Because if I'm making lots of money through my secret, why would I spend my time going out, making money, giving speeches? Unless, of course, giving the speeches about how to make money is the way I make my money, as if that's the secret. So kind of a similar thing here. The third problem, probably the most serious, is what's presented as the paradox argument, which is this. So ethical egoism tells us that we should act so as to maximize for ourselves, in my case me, in your case you, what is of value. Now, even Ayn Rand says that happiness is the highest value. And so suppose we agree with that. We take happiness to be the highest value. We agree with Ayn Rand's view, and the view, of course, many philosophers. So then the question would be is, what does happiness consist of? So, for example, why wasn't Aristotle an ethical egoist, given that he held to happiness? Well, his view is that happiness is involves having friends, loved ones, living in the right sort of society, etc. Basically being kind of a virtuous person. Now, having all these having good friends, loved ones, living in a just and caring society, etc., being virtuous, would seem to require people to act as a friend, to love others, to be just and care, to be virtuous, etc. But of course, that would be opposed to ethical egoism, because ethical egoism is I try to maximize for myself what is of value. And if happiness is what is of value, when you get happiness in that way, then it would be self-defeating. By trying to selfishly be happy, I would be unable to be happy. I could only be happy if I became unselfish. So it would seem that ethical egoism, seen as a form of selfishness, would undercut its own goal. You couldn't be both an ethical egoist and be happy. So how can the ethical egoists reply back to this? Well, they have quite a few options for this. One is an ethical egoist might hold that there's some other high value, that it's not happiness that's of the highest value, and the value that they value can be consistent with this kind of selfishness. Having, for example, there's the question of whether it's better to be, feared or loved, and some people say it's better to be feared, and having like wealth and power. So someone could have, instead of having good friends, loved ones, living in a just and caring society, they could be, say, a powerful person who doesn't have friends but is feared, is not loved, but has people that have to, appease them and, serve them. And they live in a bad society, but society benefits them. Since people, they have the power and influence and wealth, etc., they benefit from all this, all this badness. Another option is to agree that happiness is a good, but that happiness doesn't require these conditions, that this is a very lovey, nice view of happiness. And so one could say that the egoist could be happy, and happiness doesn't require all those what we consider to be like non-selfish virtues, that someone could be selfish and happy. Now, a third option, which we'll look at when we talk about Glaucon talking in the Ring of Gyges, is that a person can, of course, fake all those attributes. A person could be selfishly looking for people who are their friend, or think they're, I guess they would be their friends, but they would not be reciprocated. People love them, but they do not love. And living in a just and caring society, but being, not just and caring themselves. So as long as a person could fake these qualities, they could enjoy the benefits of their true egoism, essentially again being a wolf among sheep, and their false altruism. And again, Glaucon argues for this in the Ring of Gyges. So those are three kind of standard criticisms of ethical egoism: that it seems inconsistent, that it's kind of ironic for people to publish views on this, and probably the most serious is the paradox argument, that how can you truly maximize what is of greatest value if one is selfish? But then, of course, the ethical egoist has replies to all of these. So that takes us to the end of ethical egoism. Next, we'll head on to maybe a kinder, gentler view, perhaps, of utilitarianism. So stay safe, and I'll see you in the future.